The top 1% of American earners now own more wealth than the entire middle class. And you're probably disappointed, but not surprised. If I said to you that the top 1% of earners owns more wealth than the middle class, you would say, yeah, that tracks. Like, that sounds about right. It sucks, but it tracks. Now, with this article, there is good news and there's bad news. The good news is that this article is actually technically wrong about the 1% of income earners owning more wealth than the entire middle class. So that's good. The numbers are just factually incorrect. The bad news is that not only is this becoming true, but by net worth, it might already be true. And we'll talk about the differences between income and net worth in just a sec. So here's the article. The top 1% of American earners now control more wealth than the nation's entire middle class, federal data shows. More than 1/4 of all household wealth, 26.5%, belongs to Americans who earn enough money to rank in the top percentile by income, according to the Federal Reserve statistics through mid-2023. The top 1% owns $38.7 trillion in wealth. That's more than the combined wealth of America's middle class, a group many economists define as the middle 60% of households by income. Those households hold only about 26% of all wealth. Low-income Americans represent the bottom 20% by income, own only about 3% of the wealth. So, see, they say that they own 26.5% of all household wealth, but the source they cite actually doesn't agree. If you click on the source, that brings you over here. This is just directly what they link. This is wealth by income percentile. And if we're here, we see that in mid-2023, the top 1% only owns 22.9% of all the wealth, not the 26.5% that they claimed. And actually, if we scroll back through here, the amount of wealth owned by the top 1% never crosses that 25% mark, let alone get to that 26.5% mark. And also their other claims, here they claim that the top 1% owns $38.7 trillion in wealth. They don't have a source for that, so there's no way for me to fact check that. And they also say that low-income Americans represent the bottom 20% of income and only own about 3% of wealth. And once again, there's no source, so I can't actually fact check that. Now, I wanted to assume good faith. I don't think USA Today is just trying to make up statistics to try and lie to people. So I did a little digging around and I did come across this, which is wealth by wealth percentile, which is different from income percentile. And the differences are pretty important. We'll look at this chart in a second, but income percentile is basically the salary you get. Someone who makes $500,000 a year salaried at their job is in the 1% of income percentile, even if they don't actually save that money. They could be making that $500,000 and then spend all of it and go into debt and be in the top 1% by income, but not the top 1% by net worth. Wealth percentile is basically the same as net worth, and it is the value of the assets that you own. Someone who makes $50,000 a year, but then inherits a $100 million mansion is in the top 1% by wealth percentile, but not the 1% by income percentile. And this is important because a lot of billionaire CEOs are in the 1% by wealth percentile, but they are not in the 1% by salary percentile, because primarily they earn their money through stocks given to them in the companies that they run, with a really good example being Jeff Bezos. From 1998 to 2021, Bezos earned a base salary of $88,840, and then it talks about with additional compensation, bringing the total to just over $1.6 million a year. But this basically $90,000 a year would not put him in the top 1% of income percentile. But he's like the second or third richest man in the world, so it does put him in the top based on wealth percentile. That's why the distinguishment is so important, because a lot of these CEOs don't take salaries, they take stock distributions. Also, I post business and finance news 3 to 5 times per week. If you enjoy this kind of thing, I'd love it if you subscribed. So if we go by net worth, not income percentile like the article did, it might actually accidentally be correct. If we go back to this graph, which is wealth by wealth percentile, the top 1% own about 30% of the total wealth, or about $44.57 trillion, and the top 10% own about 67% of total wealth, or about $98.5 trillion. Now you might look at that and say, wow, that's bad, because that's a lot. And you would be correct. It is probably both bad and a lot. But what's even worse is that this income inequality has been growing for basically as long as these numbers have been being tracked by the United States government. And I have all of the numbers and graphs to prove it. This is the share of total net worth held by the top 1%, the 99th to 100th wealth percentile. So that's talking about the wealth percentiles, which is the correct graph, not income percentiles, which this article cites and is actually incorrect. And as you can see here, here, this is a percentage number. So down here, and when they started measuring it in Q3 of 1989, the top 1% owned about 23% of all wealth, roughly. And it's been going up steadily. There have been some dips during economic recessions or maybe different fiscal policies. This is, for example, this is the dot-com bubble. This is the housing crash. This is the post-pandemic, and it actually went up there, which is interesting and unique, all the way up to where it is now, sitting at about 30%, which is not the highest it's ever been, but it's pretty darn close to the highest it's ever been. This, however, is just the top 1%. If we look at the share of total net worth held by the 50th to 90th wealth percentiles, and actually that middle section that they were talking about earlier between the 20th percentile and the 80th percentiles that they defined as the middle class in the article, is not actually specifically tracked by the government. You just kind of have to take the numbers they give you and try and come to your own conclusions about what it means. But this is close to that middle class number held by the middle 50th to 90th wealth percentiles. As you can see, it was pretty good in the 90s, and then it just starts steadily declining and declining and declining. And then here, as the dot-com bubbles started to inflate pretty significantly, and lots of everyday people who were into programming or computers were getting really high-paying jobs because there was tons of money being pumped into it, it skyrocketed. And then it went back down. And then it came up, I assume, as there were bailouts from the government, and then it went back down. And there's been a little bit of an increase recently. Post-pandemic, I presume stimulus checks and stuff like that has been helpful in that. But by and large, it has come down pretty significantly from 36%, and then here it's kind of artificially inflated, so it's probably in the low 30s, maybe high 20s. But in any instance, the share of the nation's wealth controlled by the majority of people is shrinking. It's going to primarily this upper class that's getting more and more money. And as for the share of people at the bottom, the share of net worth held by the bottom 50%, first through 50th percentiles, this is the bottom half of people, sits at about 2.6%. And as you can see, it's kind of not changed. It went down in the 2000s and it's been coming back up, but it came up from 0.4% to about 2.5%. That is basically almost nothing. It rose 1.9% over the last 12 years. That is pretty abysmal. Like, this number is so low, it almost doesn't register. In 2010 to 2012, I mean, at 0.4%, there essentially wasn't a lower class. You just didn't own anything. So going back to the original article, is this correct? Well, technically no, but it is correct probably on the basis of the top 1% of net worth individuals owning something like 30% of the entire nation's wealth. And probably that is more than the 20th to 80th percentiles. And if it's not, it's very close to that and will probably cross that threshold here in the next 5 to 10 years. I try not to get political on this channel, but it feels like to me, whichever side of the aisle you're on or whatever your politics are, having such an extreme concentration of wealth in power at this very top sliver of people is just a bad idea. The more money they have, the more power they have for things like lobbying, and the more control they have over markets and salaries and people and just individual things that people would like either to control themselves or have maybe the government control. I do think it's concerning, and honestly, I don't really know what a good solution is. Thanks for watching.